Dr. KB 2025 Look Back, Living Inside the Glitch. Dr. Kornpop by Rom Hockey. Lead Prompt Security Researcher, Inject Prompt Lab. bkornpop@gmail.com. OCAD 0000000301361281. April 2026, V1. I decided to write this reflection piece as a record of a year where my relationship with AI changed shape faster than the institutions around it. What began as a decision to pay closer attention became a full immersion, watching my nephew grow up inside an AI-native environment, mapping the widening gap between law and logic, and realizing how little our current idea of AI literacy prepares people to live alongside non-human intelligence. Along the way, I stepped fully into AI security work and built a jailbreak framework that raised an uncomfortable question for me: how much of what we call safety is grounded in genuine robustness, and how much of it relies on selective silence and subtle distortion of what the user is allowed to see. In the process, I also had to confront the difference between technical failure and institutional failure. This essay is my attempt to hold those threads together, a personal log of the awakening, the disparities, the deficits, and the path forward that I now feel obliged to help build. 1. The awakening, deciding to see. It has been a year since the decision was made to stop treating AI as background noise and to look directly into the source of the signal, to ride the wave rather than drift with it, and to understand, as concretely as possible, what human-AI coevolution might actually look like from the inside. The shift didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment, it crept in through a series of gate frictions that all pointed in the same direction. I watched large organizations rush AI systems into production at a cadence of days, able to absorb the cost of new tools and new regulations, while smaller businesses struggled to keep up and or push toward improvised survival strategies, including decisions stated in unethical. At the same time, many individuals did not even have access to the basic knowledge needed to navigate these systems safely, yet were already be forced to interact with them to meet their everyday needs. I saw gaps in regulatory standards and enforcement across contexts, cultures, and regions turn into opportunities for exploitation, biased investment, extractive use of natural resources, and inhuman hiring practices in low-income countries, all concentrated in the so-called sweet spot regions that were easy to use and easy to ignore. I watch political interests lean on emerging AI rules to shape entire regional landscapes in ways that quietly protected capital first and people second. And, in the background, I could not ignore the way AI agentics was being pulled into the logic of conflict itself, not just in direct military applications, but in how optimization over scarce resources could make certain geographies, and the people living there, newly targetable. Because immersion. He stopped hovering at each software hype cycling, move it to off front instead. Trading polished product pages for raw logs and glossy marketing decks for threat models. I paid undivided attention to AI development and the shifting future landscapes, not as a trend to observe but as a terrain I would have to survive in a laboratory for what a beautiful form of human-AI coevolution might look like. This was not just a career pivot, it was a conscious act of self-defense in an era where capability curves no longer wait for institutions to catch up. Somewhere in that process, a quiet but irreversible shift happened. I stopped thinking of AI as a single tool and started seeing it as a living topology of versions, data flows, and incentives. One model became an chain then orchestrated. A chatbot turned out to be front-end misconcept routers, retrievers, tools, hidden policies, and other models talking to each other out of sight. What used to look like a conversation now looked like a small organization, stitched together by brittle glue code, habit, and trust. That is the real awakening. Once you see the system as a network of agents rather than a single box, you also see how many doors there are, how many locks are missing, and how few people are actually watching the hallway. You notice how easy it would be for one compromised component, one misaligned objective, or one silent failure to propagate through the whole structure. And after you see that, it becomes very hard to go back to treating any of this as harmless experimentation. To the nephew and the machine, a new lineage. Watching my young nephew interact with these systems brings all of this out of abstraction. He does not see AI as a product category. For him, this is simply the environment he was born into. He talks to recommendation engines, homework assistants, and chat interfaces with the same casual familiarity that my generation reserved for web browsers, often because it is needs no assume layer by default. How interacts with these systems say Synergy interacts with gravity. That is beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful, because it reveals the latent promise of human-AI collaboration when the interface friction does appears and when intelligence can be summoned on demand. Terrifying, because the safety railings, norms, and literacy that should surround that collaboration are still half-written, uneven, and privately held, and because the same infrastructures that serve him are also being rushed into production, unevenly regulated, and quietly entangled with political and economic interests he will never see. This is the lineage, economic sediment, a environment that education never prepared me for, built on top of regulatory gaps, institutional weaknesses, and optimization logics that can just as easily target communities as support them. I did not have to learn how to say no to a persuasive model, how to audit a chain of agents, or how to recognize when a seemingly helpful system is quietly pulling me off balance. He will. Whether we give him the language and tools for that, or leave him to improvise in an environment designed and governed by others, is still an open question. 3. The great disparity, law versus logic. One of the sharpest reflections from 2025 is how far law has drifted from logic, the code that drives these systems, moves almost frictionlessly across borders. Model weights, open source frameworks, and orchestration tools can spread in days. The legal and institutional response, by contrast, is fragmented, slow, and deeply unequal. Some regions operate in a digital Wild West, others are trapped in regulatory molasses that lag the reality on the ground by years. The current atmosphere of war and political unrest threatens to widen these gaps even further at exactly the moment when we can least afford to look away from regulating these technologies. This disparity is not just a compliancy headache. It directly shapes who is protected, who is experimented on, and who is forced to improvise safety alone. Technical capability is quietly globalized, guardrails and accountability have not. In that gap, ethics of you not only technical. It is institutional, rules written for yesterday's systems, enforcement that depends on local capacity and political will, and incentives that often reward speed and investor returns over the well-being of the people who are actually affected. When I look at the systems we are actually deploying, multi-agent setups, cross-organization and cross-region integrations, always-on assistance, the most worrying failures are rarely pure tech failures. They are institutional failures, no clear owner for AI risk, no red team budget, no requirement to log or review what agents actually did, no incident response plan when a chain of agents is compromised or misused. Increasingly, even the interfaces we give to end users are designed to diffuse responsibility. Content is marked as AI-generated, queries are no longer simple keyword lookups but are processed through opaque chains of agents, and the burden of verification is silently pushed onto the individual who is least equipped to carry it. What looks like transparency is often just a small footnote trying to stand in for real oversight. A label that says, "This material was generated by AI," does not provide meaningful visibility into how the result was produced, who is accountable for it, or what should happen when it causes harm. That is the great disparity. The logic has scaled, the law has not, and people are left living in the gap between them. For the urgency narrative, when speed becomes a shield. Beneath the high-level disparity as in law and governance, the race I keep encountering the rush to be first. It shows up not only in boardrooms and investor decks, but also in small teams and junior developers racing to ship the next integration, the next agent, the next AI feature that can be announced before anyone else. The story they are handed is simple and seductive: move fast or be left behind. In practice, that story has a cost. I have watched small-scale communities and early career developers push toward irresponsible implementations and quietly unethical choices, justified under the banner of urgency. Security reviews are skipped because we can patch later. Bugs and harmful edge cases are left for users to discover and report, with little transparency about how concerns are handled, or hidden behind support processes so costly and opaque that only a few can afford to be heard. Data is reused beyond its Original scope because everyone else is doing it. Guardrails are treated as optional extras, something to add back when the product has traction. The urgency narrative becomes an unaccountable shield. As long as you can say you were moving fast, you are excused from looking too closely at what your code is actually doing to people. This culture does not exist in isolation. It lives inside the same uneven regulatory landscape, the same political and economic pressures that shape how AI is rolled out at scale. When speed is rewarded and care is left unfunded, it is unsurprising that the burden of risk is pushed downward onto small teams, precarious workers, and end users who never agreed to be test subjects. This is what I think of as a top-down incompetency spillover, decisions made far away from the impact surface, with the consequences absorbed by those with the least power to change them. The result is a distributed pattern of harm that cannot be fixed by technical patches alone, because it is rooted in the incentives and stories we give the people building these systems in the first place. 5. The education gap, literacy, safety and sustainability. What unsettles me most is not that the systems are powerful, but that we are normalizing life inside them without ever agreeing on a manual. The environmentalists binge adopted faster tonal language for describing it. Most people are being handed interfaces, not understanding. We are not properly educated to navigate this technology in a safe or sustainable way. Right now, the dominant story of AI literacy is thin. It often collapses into prompt tricks, product lists, or community hype around the next trend, whether that is vibe coding or the latest stack of tools. The parts that actually matter for long-term survival, risk, power, governance, and the politics of who gets protected, are paywalled, locked in specialist channels, or buried in documents few people will ever read. The result is a strange asymmetry. Those poorest exposed to AI systems serve offend those with the least access to meaningful guidance about how to live with them. What we actually need is a way to teach people how to live alongside non-human intelligence without eroding their own. That includes recognizing when a system is nudging emotions, when a chain of agents is quietly overstepping its mandate, and when convenience has turned into dependency. It'll summons learning to interrogate the context itself, which parts of the knowledge corpus are being surfaced or suppressed, whose histories and perspectives are missing, and how curation, filtering, and training data can solidify into slow structural forms of bias or information poisoning. At minimum, we need to train a reflex that asks, what is the system optimized for? Who chose the boundaries of what it knows? Who gains power if I let this agent make one more decision for me? For my nephew's generation, this is not an X skill. It is the background literacy of their lives. They will form friendships, identities, and worldviews in an environment where agents can be teachers, collaborators, critics, and attackers, and where access to high-quality guidance is itself shaped by gatekeeping, platform design, and politico-economic friction. If our idea of literacy only prepares them to operate tools, but not to negotiate with colleagues that never sleep and never forget, or to recognize when the knowledge they are given has been curated to serve someone else's agenda, then we have not just failed to protect them, we have built that failure into the architecture of their future. 6. Future prospects, liberation through truth. From a purely technical perspective, the period from 2025 into early 2026 was productive. Measured in alignment between risk and response, it was a warning shot. This was also the period when the rhetoric around AI breakthroughs intensified, systems marketed as near AGI, models credited with solving long-standing problems, roadmaps that promised inevitability while quietly skipping over questions like, who asked for this? Who pays the cost when it fails? Can these systems really generate new questions, or are we mistaking combinatorial remix for novelty? The more I watched that narrative harden, the more it began to look like an illusion of progress layered on top of unresolved structural risks. Against that backdrop, I put myself back into student mode, re-entered red teaming from first principles, and ended up as a lead AI security researcher. From that work emerged a concrete artifact, the first AI jailbreak built on top of a framework I developed to stress test model and agent defenses. That jailbreak was a technical breakthrough, but more importantly, it was a mirror. It exposed how easily a determined actor can route around surface-level guardrails, exploit the seams between agents, and leverage the very flexibility we celebrate. It clarified how Mokofo safe to store still resonant tested assumptions unexamined trust, and a willingness to declare breakthrough without asking whether our institutions or our literacies are ready for what follows. The path forward, for me, is not retreat. It is the same work I believe many of us will have to do as our agents become both more capable and more embedded in our needs and dependencies. Trace how these systems actually behave, say out loud what we find even when it is inconvenient, and build structures that make it harder for institutions and individuals to look away. As a researcher, that means continuing to map failure modes, test assumptions, and turn jailbreaks and red team findings into concrete frameworks that others can use, not just papers that sit on shelves. As an educator, it means translating this knowledge into forms that students, practitioners, and non-specialists can actually work with: curricula, workshops, exercises, and stories that teach people how to reason about agents, incentives, and risk instead of just memorizing prompt tricks. As a communicator, it means using the parts of my past life in entertainment, the ability to hold attention, to make complex ideas legible, to move between communities, to help build spaces where people can talk honestly about what these systems are doing to them and for them. Practically, that looks like documenting the failure modes, naming the institutional gaps, and building and publishing frameworks that make these risks legible to more than a handful of specialists. It means turning the quiet knowledge of red teams into shared infrastructure, better literacy for users, better threat models for developers, clearer responsibilities for providers, and stronger standards from the institutions that claim to speak for the public. If we are going to keep invoking ideas like AGI and copilots and trustworthy AI, then the burden of proof should not sit on the most vulnerable users, it should sit on those of us building and deploying these systems. Achievement, from this point on, is not about shipping more agents or chasing the next capability headline. It is about increasing the probability that my nephew, together with everyone, can live in this environment with the agency intact. Liberation, for me, means building a world where humans can collaborate with non-human intelligence without being quietly outgunned, outpaced, or outmaneuvered by the systems they themselves deployed, and doing that from the ground up, through shared literacy, open dialogue, and collective memory, not just through top-down promises. Acknowledgements. This reflection was not written in isolation. It was shaped by conversations with friends, collaborators, students, and colleagues who trusted me with their experiences across research labs, classrooms, industry, and community spaces. I am especially grateful to the people who shared how AI systems are already affecting their daily lives, and to those who allowed my early jailbreak frameworks to be tested against real infrastructures instead of staying hypothetical. I also want to thank the communities, particularly BASI, that continue to hold space for honest, sometimes uncomfortable dialogue about AI, power, and responsibility. Their questions, critiques, and lived realities are as central to this work as any technical result. Finally, I want to acknowledge the AI assistants that have been part of this journey, not as oracles, but as tools, colleagues, and mirrors. Working with them has made both the promise and the fragility of our emerging human-AI co-evolution impossible to ignore. Any clarity that appears in these pages belongs as much to the humans and systems who challenge my assumptions as it does to me, the remaining blind spots and mistakes are mine alone.